throughout the session, unless you're asking a question at the end, just to keep things. And when you enter, I think you'll be automatically muted, so I don't think it's going to be a huge problem. Today's format, we're going to give Romit about 45 minutes to present. I understand that we have started a little bit late, so I'm going to go through things as quickly as possible. And then there should be sort of 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A afterwards. If you'd like to ask a question at the end, please do raise your hand and I will call on you. And if you prefer to present your question in the Teams chat, then please do that and I will feed it back to Romit. And I think now on to the introduction. So we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Romit Chowdhury. He's a senior lecturer in sociology at Erasmus University College in Rotterdam. His research interests include urban studies, masculinity studies, ethnography, and literary theory. His monograph, City of Men, Masculinities and Everyday Morality on Public Transport, is an ethnography of the relationship between masculinities, co-presence, and urban mobilities. The project draws on the laboring lives of male public transport workers in Kolkata and their interactions with commuters and traffic police to show how everyday morality and cooperation on public transport reproduces male privilege in the city. I'm going to hand over to Romit. I'm just going to share the screen and Romit, then I will hand straight over to you. So just let me know that you can see the presentation. Is that there?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Please do go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen, for the introduction and also for being so kind as to operate the slides, which are both rudimentary and few. And I have to say that I've followed the work of colleagues at the Transport Studies Unit over several years. So it's especially wonderful to be sharing my research with this audience. I will be presenting a section from my recently published book, which Helen just referred to. And as she described, the book is really an ethnography of the everyday labor geography of auto rickshaw drivers and taxi operators in Kolkata, in the eastern Indian city of Kolkata in India. And what I try to do in the book is to analyze their interactions with each other, with passengers, and also with traffic police. And I try to show how masculinities come to matter in everyday experiences of mobility in cities of the global south. And in particular, I try to show that very mundane gestures of cooperation and morality on public transport are in fact important modalities for reproducing patriarchal power in the city. Today's presentation will be focusing quite specifically on the theme of morality. But before I launch into the discussion itself, some contextual information is necessary. Yes, Helen, if you could just move to the next slide, please.
Is it there?
Yes.
Okay.
This is fine. Right. So by way of contextual information, firstly, it's important to share that motorized forms of public transport and their drivers are represented in mainstream media as the very picture of urban disorder. So in both the English language and the so-called vernacular presses and broadcast media, they routinely portray auto rickshaw and taxi drivers as the so-called lumpen proletariat, as a menacing threat to middle-class women's safety and to public order in the city more generally. And this is routinely evident in letters that are written to newspapers of prominent English language dailies. For instance, one letter describes that, and I'm quoting the letter here, stubborn, audacious, and outrageous are the words that describe the behavior of taxi drivers in Calcutta. At night, they are either drunk or desperate to earn the extra buck. The city police are more their accomplices than responsible public servants, unquote. So this is sort of the general ethos within which public transport workers operate in Calcutta. Secondly, taxi drivers and auto rickshaw drivers belong to somewhat different social groups. Now, while the families of most auto rickshaw drivers in Kolkata have lived in the city for over several generations, taxi drivers are in fact first-generation migrants, many from the nearby states of Bihar, Chhattisgarh, and Jharkhand. And these are resource-deprived states in eastern India. Now, the majority of taxi drivers belong to lower castes and they are Hindu. And as first-generation single migrants, many young taxi drivers, in fact, cohabit in shared rooms. Now, this is quite different from auto drivers who often live with their families in urban slums. And another thing to note is that auto rickshaws in Kolkata, they ply on designated routes on a shared basis. And this is one major reason why their drivers' experiences of urban space, auto rickshaw drivers' experience of urban space, is patterned quite differently from that of taxi operators. And this is because taxis roam the entirety of the city's landscape, whereas auto rickshaws ply on designated paths. Now, this difference in geography of operation, together with their other social identities, as we have just seen, influences their relationship with each other, with commuters, and also with traffic police. Now, that said, what do morality and masculinity really have to do with public transport? Now, in several of the encounters which I describe in the book, one can observe the workings of moral orientations between transport workers, traffic personnel, and passengers. What do I mean by that? A migrant taxi driver who would occasionally buy sex from sex workers in Kolkata, he decides to stop doing so after he has children. Now, here, an ethical discourse which ties responsible fatherhood to a conception of sin which perpetuates from parent to child. This is what influences this particular driver's sexual choices in the city. Let me convey another instance. A police officer scolds an auto rickshaw driver for using very abusive language towards a passenger. The officer tells him that his daughter, the auto rickshaw driver's daughter, would be very ashamed of him if she heard him speak in this manner. Now, this is no way for a good father to behave on city streets. This is what the traffic police is telling the auto rickshaw driver. Now, here we see notions of good fatherhood being used to enforce orderly conduct towards passengers. In another instance, an auto rickshaw driver expressed moral repulsion at transport workers who sexually assault women. And he explains that being a transport worker is a noble profession. And why is this so? This is because public transport work is about providing public service to urban residents. So, in this narrative, male sexual violence is discouraged by an ethic of public good that normatively frames transport work in the city. Now, these moments and others, which I will outline as we go along, capture how the routines of public transportation become really practical workshops where urban dwellers cultivate and perform ethical personhoods. Now, co presence in transit systems, be it as a driver or as a passenger, is negotiated by assuming distinctly moral positions about the right way to be. Now, to make sense of the problems and opportunities of daily mobilities, people routinely attach moral values to people and places. And it is through ascribing these moral meanings to everyday urban happenings that public transport really emerges as a social field. Everyday moral expectations from men and women influence both conflict and cooperation on public transport. And my suggestion here is that the operation of morality really provides insights into how patriarchal structures are maintained in a changing city. So, for instance, middle class suspicions about the urban poor, especially their readiness to impute extractive intentions to the working class, often obstructs kindly gestures from transport workers. For instance, when acts of goodness from drivers, such as, say, helping a waylaid passenger to reach their destination as conveniently as possible, when such acts of generosity are misread by passengers as deceitful, these reactions end up compelling transport workers to reconsider their intention to do good. So the middle class passengers' urgency to be street smart, to not be hoodwinked by drivers, clashes with the moral intentions of the urban poor to be helpful. Now, when such recognition is thwarted of the desire on behalf of the urban poor, this significantly depletes the quality of urban life for the working class. For instance, transport workers register a great deal of frustration at their ethical conduct, at what they see as their ethical conduct being repeatedly misread as dishonest. So their ethical conduct gets read as acts of dishonesty by the middle class, and this significantly depletes the quality of their life in the city. In fact, transport workers routinely expressed a desire for their kindness to be acknowledged by passengers. And they characterize these acts of goodness as being really futile if they pass unnoticed or are misconstrued as exploitative. So, as a gesture of kindly indulgence, for example, an auto rickshaw driver may allow a mother traveling with a young child to pay only for the adult and not for the child. But drivers become very reluctant to do good when such offers pass unacknowledged. From such omissions, by omissions I mean from such acts of from the lack of such acknowledgement, the figure of the ungrateful passenger arises, and by extension, an everyday calculus of who is seen as deserving and who is seen as unworthy of the kindness of strangers in the city. Now, moral identities, we should notice, are created at the confluence of how people characterize themselves and also what others say about them. So, if transport workers present themselves as ethical urban actors, some of this self presentation is in fact corroborated by others. For instance, some young middle class women will recall with a great deal of gratitude small acts of care from older taxi drivers, such as helping, say, a newcomer in the city to carry heavy luggage and cross a busy thoroughfare. A middle aged man whom I interviewed remembers receiving a call from his young son's hand phone. And he was informed by an auto rickshaw driver that the boy's leg had been scrapped in a freak accident. And he was assured, the father was assured, that the driver would be next to the boy until he collects the child. Now, importantly, traffic police, who are often in a situation of conflict with transport workers, are also prompt to appreciate the reliability of drivers in situations of crisis. So, for example, be it ferrying people who are in distress, who have lost their wallet, or say taking someone who has been in an accident to the hospital because the ambulance cannot be relied on, say clearing obstructions from the roads after a stormy day. It is transport workers, auto rickshaw drivers, taxi drivers, whom the police depend on rather than municipal services to keep people moving in the city. Now, such expressions of what I would like to call handyman masculinity on the street make cities safe and functional for the urban public. Now, this is a form of moral masculinity that has both the hardiness to execute physically difficult labor and the willingness to do so for the benefit of the larger urban public. Now, if such acts of goodness from working class men offer support during city living, they are also set against the selfish indifference of the urban middle classes, who are often said to quickly turn a blind eye to the suffering of strangers. And in my conversations with both traffic police and public transport workers, this seemed to be the consensus that, say, the taxi operator or the auto rickshaw driver will get off from his vehicle to help, say, an elderly man who has suddenly become disoriented by a dizzy spell. But the person who's traveling in their private cars will simply drive off. Now, something to notice is that embodiment in the spaces of shared mobility, be it the taxi or the auto rickshaw, is often mediated by moral considerations. So, for instance, there are drivers and male passengers who deliberately take up more space, and they are often perceived by other drivers and co-passengers as inconsiderate. It is their selfish actions which make the journey uncomfortable for fellow commuters. And this also harms business because the auto rickshaw is then seen as less desirable as a mode of transit. Now, then there are the men who physically position themselves in ways that enable them to grope women co passengers. And then there are those, both drivers and passengers, who adopt postures which clearly signal to women co travelers in the vehicle that they will not be harmed. Now, these styles of bodily comportment in the spaces of commuting cohere, as we will see as this presentation progresses, into commuter identities that are the outcome of moral evaluations of the conduct of commuters and transport operators. Now, as drivers see it, there is a certain moral calculus to intervening in situations where a woman passenger is being sexually harassed by a co passenger or a fellow driver. Some drivers will reprimand the perpetrator only when the concerned woman protests. And the reasoning behind this is that it is itself immoral to wrongly characterize someone's action as immoral. Hence, they would rather prefer to wait for confirmation in the form of a woman's protest before acting. Now, other drivers observe a very different moral economy. They consider it an ethical necessity to intervene the very moment they notice sexual harm being perpetrated in the vehicle. Now, this moral impulse to intervene the moment they notice any kind of sexual harm stems as much from patriarchal logics of men as protectors of women and privacy as a prerequisite of sexual contact, as from ideas about bodily autonomy that erotic advances, where such interest is unwelcome, is wrong. So, what I'm trying to say is that the moral impulse to intervene in moments of sexual assault within spaces of commuting emerge both from patriarchal logics and somewhat feminist ideas about bodily autonomy. So, transport workers' styles of intervention, when they encounter this kind of unwelcome contact, proceeds from both these kinds of, moral sources, as it were. So, there are different drivers will react differently to such situations. So, when drivers single out repeat offenders, they might shame them with disapproving looks and by refusing to accept their business. And this then ends up creating a moral environment that really exceeds the limits of the event. Uh, so, this moral environment in which transport workers are ethical urban actors, this kind of which they themselves create, competes with another kind of milieu in which drivers themselves are singled out for inflicting sexual harm on women passengers. So, one plank of moral justification, which is used by the middle classes for ill treating transport workers, is that drivers often misbehave with women and hence are bad men. Now, the body of the vehicle, as a site of men's labor and as a form of public provisioning, is also often interpolated through moral terms, which proscribe certain forms of behavior in it. For many traffic personnel, traffic police, non religious decorative items, gaudy embellishments, loud music, besides actually being unlawful, are also presented as morally polluting. So, when they encounter such items, traffic law enforcement officers will often use the metaphor of a bar, which is a place of alcohol, fuel, depravity in this system of description, of course. And they will use the metaphor of the bar to rebuke drivers. That why have you made this auto rickshaw into a bar? This is the mode of address. Now, for several drivers, passengers making out on the backseat of their vehicle is seen as a defilement of the vehicle itself because it is an instrument of work. So, pleasure, be it sexual, aesthetic, or sensorial, is deemed antithetical to the virtue of work. So, in this scheme, the sacrality of the public vehicle derives from its provisioning functioning in the city, the fact that it is a public good, and from it being a source of economic sustenance for drivers and their families. The good family man is someone, of course, who provides. So, the public transport vehicle is sacred because it sustains life, the private life of drivers and the public life of the city. Now, there's something to be said here about the good city and the safe city. So, while the good city is one which is premised on socially progressive values, the safe city, of course, affords security, but within the boundaries of existing social divides. Now, the safe city, as distinct from the good city, can be glimpsed in men's sexual non involvement with women commuters, moments of indifference, and distanced engagement with sexual desire in urban life. And why am I saying this? Because if women experience the male city as one where they must routinely deflect unwanted sexual advances, survive sexual violence, eke out a space for sexual expression, then their access to city spaces is enabled when men practice sexual indifference to women in the city. Now, the reasons behind men's sexual indifference to women's presence in the urban outdoors ranges, as we have seen, from a patriarchal exaltation of monogamy to migrant men identifying the spatial location of their sexual subjectivity in the countryside rather than in the city. It's also dictated by, as we have seen, conceptions of sin being born by children of parents who have acted wrongfully. So some migrant drivers whom I interviewed chose to stay clear of any kind of sexually intimate interactions with women, whether consensual or forced, because of the social consequences of these relations being reported back in their villages. So the fear of being morally shamed and the kind of far-reaching impact that this would have on their families in the villages, in fact, influence migrant drivers' moral choices in the city. Thus, rumors in the village about men's unethical behavior in the city then functions as a form of social control. Now, this ethic of indifference, of course, is certainly not feminist, but it conditionally abates the threat of gender-based violence in city streets and momentarily creates spaces of safety and sexual pleasure for women passengers in the interiors of public vehicles. Now, this is the contours of the safe city that affords security, but within the confines of existing social divides. Now, what might a good city then be, which exceeds simple considerations of security? I would say that an image of the good city, one which is not merely safe but also just, can be captured in moments when men simply enjoy seeing acts of heterosexual intimacy in public vehicles as a kind of erotic urban theater without expecting to participate in it. And this routinely happens, for instance, in taxis, where a couple might be making out on the back seat of the taxi, and the driver is able to see some of what is happening through the rear view mirror. Now, such forms of voyeurism, it seems to me, legitimize quasi-public spaces as a site of heterosexual lust in an overall urban climate of vigilantism that actually fixes the sexually active woman as indefensible against sexual assault. The good city also emerges in moral assertions of some male transport workers that women have the right to refuse sexual contact from strangers in public spaces. The good city can also be glimpsed in anecdotes of consensual erotic encounters between drivers and working class women in the city. And these instances distill what a good city might entail because they enable women to experience sexual autonomy in the city on their own terms. However, it must be said that this is an urban sexual matrix that does not easily allow sexual desire to cross lines of caste and class. So, at the intersections of this kind of everyday morality and the routines of urban commuting, a cast of urban characters can be identified. Now, although sociologists will often relegate the term character to the domains of personality psychology, philosophy, there is also a tradition within sociological research that reads characters, especially their moral qualities, as outcomes of social processes and human agency. And character here is the ethical value which people place on their desires and their relations to others. But it is also the ascription of moral meanings to other people and places. Um, Now, characters are as much about self presentation as they are about features which are attributed to others. And of course, places as much as people can also be characters. One can speak, for instance, of the character of a neighborhood or the character of a bookstore. And certainly, cities have characters as well. And the intensity of a city's charisma may be so great as to seep into the character of people living there. Now, the characterization of people and places as having very recognizable attributes, moral attributes, and styles of moral functioning creates a very predictable pattern for urban dwellers. If people and places can be expected to behave in certain ways, this reduces the inherent uncertainty of urban life. Is there a problem with the slides? Right, I think we can move to.
Sorry,
Yes,
yes.
sorry, I forgot to. Yeah, I forgot to
No, no,
mention
that's
that, Helen.
this the one you would like?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Right. Sorry, just yeah, you can see the slide, right? Yeah, this is mine.
Auto
Yes,
rickshaws, yeah.
Yeah, the
Yep.
auto rickshaws. Yeah, that's
Perfect. Yeah.
fine. Now, the characterization of people and places as having recognizable attributes and styles, this creates a predictable pattern for urban dwellers because it becomes a way of discerning friends and foes in the circuits of mobility. And also, of course, separate by separating the good from the bad. Now, such everyday practices of moral characterization has to be read as a form of folk knowledge system about the city, and in that, they become a measure both of urban survival strategies and they also become a measure of urban social inequality. Now, this kind of everyday moral judgments enables people to survive in a city that is inherently unpredictable. But these moral and what kinds of moral discourses are enlisted by who and in what context also tells us a significant story about urban social differences. Now, how do we make sense of this kind of everyday moral characterization in the city? And I think we might take some help from literary theory to understand everyday interactions on public transport. And and the person that I use in making sense of this is the literary scholar Jane Gallup, who speaks of something called anecdotal theory as a mode of theorizing that is premised on narrative, stories, proverbs, toying with words and language. And Gallup clarifies that precisely because the anecdote and theory are seen as polarities. The anecdote is brief, it is personal, it is specific, whereas theory is seen as impersonal, it is broad, it has far-reaching consequences. So, given this dichotomy, to offer something like anecdotal theory is to cut across these oppositions. It is to present theory itself as a form of anecdote. And it is a way of theorizing by storytelling, which is attached to the contextual and to the trivial. And it is to suggest that the trivial and the contextual can also offer social illumination, commentary on social patterns. So, in anecdotal theory, the example and the generality that this example illustrates becomes indistinguishable. They become one and the same thing. And what this does is that the so called grandness of theoretical claims, so called broader arguments that we are often confronted with, they sort of simmer down to become, as it were, occasional. The anecdote then it evokes associative meanings which exceed the specificity of the event, but without claiming representativeness. So the urban characters, which are recognizable in the spaces of commuting, emerge through the many anecdotes that commuters and traffic police and transport workers, the many anecdotes that they narrate about their encounters in the city. And like characters in a fictional world, we can understand these city characters by looking at how we talk about them and how we use and respond them. So this is how a story might begin, and this is of course a story that emerged from my ethnography. So one character type that recurred in conversations with transport workers is the figure of the spoiled rich woman. So this is how these stories might be narrated. This is a very muggy summer afternoon in Kolkata. Temperatures are hovering around 40 degrees Celsius. A vacant taxi is trudging along an empty road. Now, very few people have actually bothered to venture out at this time on such a suffocating day. The cruel weather has made life very difficult for the taxi driver, and he's deciding to pretty much retire after sundown. At this moment, he sees a woman, perhaps in her early 20s, waving quite frantically at him, asking him for a ride. And the taxi driver describes her as dressed in expensive, stylish clothes. And for a moment, the driver is wondering, why is she hailing a cab instead of actually calling her personal driver to take her to her destination? He slows down near her to ask which way she wants to go. And at this moment, the taxi driver notices two very young children in their teens looking at him very crestfallen. These children had also been waiting for a taxi, and they look absolutely defeated at the prospect of having to wait for even more time for the next available taxi. The taxi driver then decides to apologetically explain to the young woman that he will ferry the kids and not her, because they seem to be near collapse from the heat. But this young woman becomes extremely angry and threatening. Since she is the one who has called him, and much before the children, she deserves to be prioritized. And she proceeds to threaten the driver that she will use every social influence available to her to ensure that he pays the heftiest of penalties if he takes the children, not her, and not her. Now, the following day, the driver, the taxi driver, is summoned to a police station. The young woman is present, along with her very influential father, and the driver is made to recount the events of the previous day. His defenses fall on deaf ears. He's unable to persuade his audience that he was right, that it was a moral right to prioritize the children. And in the face of very aggressive questioning by the police officer in charge, and a range of accusations from the woman and her father, the driver finds himself trapped in his own words, and he's unable to defend himself. And when the driver is finally allowed to leave the station, he has been fined an amount equivalent to several days of earnings. And as he walks to his taxi, he drives off. He told me that he resolved never to interact with young women of what he called high social class, because he associates them with what he described as a bratty behavior. He associates them with powerful fathers. He associates them with humiliation. And the so-called spoiled upper class woman is, according to him, trouble. So this is one recurring character type that emerges in the spaces of commuting in the city. Another two character types that emerge are the sadistic policeman and also the kind policeman. So what are they? What are the moral contours of these two character types? There is one type of policeman whom drivers of transport vehicles must watch out for. And that is the sadistic policeman who really relishes wielding power over the urban public. And this is a particular type of traffic sergeant. He is someone who walks with swagger. His gait bears sort of awareness of the uniform that he's wearing and the respect that it exacts from others. And an auto rickshaw driver remembers being stopped by this particular type of sergeant and being questioned about floral decorations in his vehicle. And this auto rickshaw driver was still new in his trade, and he didn't really have a full grip on the ropes of the road, as it were. So he spoke back to the sergeant. He said, "Yes, I have some flowers here. So what?" And the driver recalls the chilling warning that he received from the sergeant in response. With a smile on his face, the sergeant told him that, "Remember this, that every time I stop you on the road, you will lose and I will win. And remember this for as long as you're an auto driver. And please recount this to all your friends. If I stop any of you, it's never for nothing. It means that you will have to part with something that is precious to you. And I don't care how you will feed your family. It's my rules, and I will not let anyone get away with it." Now, stories such as this circulate among drivers, and they kind of harden into a character type that the best way to deal with the sadistic traffic policeman is either to avoid him entirely or to defer to his authority. But there is also another kind of policeman who is seen as the benevolent type. Now, this is the type of traffic police, for instance, who might be called on by an angry passenger to reprimand a taxi driver for refusing a short distance trip. Now, instead of berating the driver, this is the kind of it's a kind of traffic police who urges the passenger to be much more understanding. The driver has managed to find a spot to park his vehicle. Now, if he takes the passenger to the mall that is a mere 10-minute walk away, he will have to give up that spot and keep moving because parking spaces for taxis are so insufficient in the city. The fare for such a brief trip would not compensate for the fuel costs that the driver would have to incur in remaining on the move. And this kind of benevolent traffic policeman would urge the passenger to understand that without factoring in these calculations, the taxi driver wouldn't really be able to sustain their families. And drivers will recall stray conversations with this cop, with this kind of traffic police, fleeting exchanges while they are paying for teas or snacks at a roadside tea kiosk. brief disclosures of biographical details, a nod of recognition sometimes, but that's it. A third type of moral characterization in spaces of commuting are again the inconsiderate and friendly passengers. Maybe we can move to the next slide, Helen. Yes. So this is the taxi driver who clearly recalls the day that he realized that people in the city only care about themselves. And he was very sure that the lane was a one-way street. But the two passengers whom he was ferrying, they insisted that they knew the locality very well and it was okay to drive down that lane. The driver yields to their insistence, and within minutes, he is stopped by a traffic police. The driver steps out of the vehicle to plead with the cop to indulge him, to not impose a heavy fine. But it's not to be. The taxi driver had to pay. Now, when he returns to his vehicle, he finds that the passengers, it is for them that he had taken the wrong turn, they had disappeared. Now, seeing trouble with the police, they had simply left without paying the fare. Now, these passengers also harden into a character type who are seen as the inconsiderate type. And they don't consider taxi drivers to be humans. People who have brothers, who have sons, who have fathers, who are husbands. And for them, drivers are no different from machines that simply get people from point A to point B. Now, of course, the question is what makes passengers likable? Who is the friendly, considerate passenger? And a narrative that came up repeatedly is if a passenger treats me as a transport worker, if a passenger treats me like a brother, I will also treat him like one. And an auto rickshaw driver recounts how there is a young chap, a sales executive for an insurance company. He mainly works in the neighborhood along which this young auto driver operates. He's one of his regular passengers. He commutes by his auto pretty much every day of the week, often several times in a day because he has to go back and forth. And they often chat. They know quite a bit about each other's lives. The insurance guy, for instance, is working very hard to buy an apartment. He wants to move his aging parents out of the rental home. He wants to marry a girl that he has been dating. And the driver appreciates that he spontaneously shares such details about his life because this kind of self disclosure is itself seen as a form of respect. And this is the type of passenger who doesn't maintain a sort of distance superiority with the driver. Their jobs pay more. The insurance guy's job, of course, pays more. They are much more socially respectable than auto drivers. But there is also a kind of mutual understanding that they are both basically striving for the same things. They're trying their best to provide a good life for their kin. Now, what does all of this really add up to? The stories that I've narrated here. Now, studies of the moral worlds of working class communities, anthropological, sociological studies, show that working poor often dissociate moral value from socioeconomic status to identify other indices, such as, say, self-disciplining, such as, say, responsible conduct, toil as a kind of virtue, labor as a kind of virtue, in order to create moral worth. A lot of recent sociological work on morality makes a very useful distinction between thin and thick morality, which I think is helpful for understanding the kinds of moral orientations which are at play on public transport. So while thin morality is a very are comprises of very easy, relatively easy judgments about what is good and appropriate in any given situation, thick morality involves the creation of moral identities and practices over a much longer duration that, in fact, seep into how social institutions, social domains operate. Now, the urban characters that I have been describing in the spaces of commuting capture, I would say, the workings of a thin morality that over time, through repeated anecdotal invocation, harden into a kind of thick morality of the city. Now, something to notice is that the temporality of transit life actually disallows in-depth knowledge flows between drivers, passengers, and police. It's a sort of hit and go, touch and go situation, of course. So consequently, the city characters that emerge through these stories are flat. They are devoid of the kind of rounded details that we would associate with intimate biographies. Because the routines of movement on public transport certainly only make possible this kind of light touch knowing of strangers. But this kind of surface interpretation is sufficient for the purpose that urban characters are required in the first place. And that is identify sources of danger, identify sources of support, conflict, cooperation, and also appropriate and wrongful conduct. Now, in the city, as a community of strangers, character types, I would say, also capture the kind of city that is desired by transport workers and also some of the impediments to achieving this kind of desired city. Now, this thin morality, through repeated storytelling, through repeated invocation, becomes relatively stable urban characters. And these characters then become a much more encompassing social filter through which co-presence in transport spaces become intelligible to those who are using these spaces. Now, how do we speak of gendered subjectivities in the city on public transport in relationship to morality? Helen, I just wanted to check, how am I doing for time?
Sorry, so if you can sort of close in about 3 minutes, and there's 10 minutes for questions.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks.
So,
Sorry.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So, how do we speak of gender subjectivities in relationship to morality? I would say that this ethnography really reveals that the morality of kinship extends much beyond the family to mediate relationships in the city. At several moments of encounter on public transport, which I've just described, the private domains of family and intimacy become enmeshed in the public worlds of labor and urban sociability much more generally. So these kinds of interactions are routinely shaped by kin morality. And how do we make sense of this skin morality? In the Brahmanical system of thought, a key figure around whom dharma, which connotes right living and right being, a key figure around whom this sort of dharma hinges is the householder, who is endowed with the responsibility of discharging debts which every person is born with. The householder is the man in the world. He's associated with the virtue of social reproduction. He's entrusted with the duty of establishing and sustaining the family. Now, the householder, in fact, captures a pan-Indian hegemonic masculinity project that influences, I would say, this kind of kin morality on public transport. And just to wrap up, and I'm happy to elaborate exactly how the figure of the householder mediates interactions on public transport. But what I would say is that the playing out of conflict, cooperation, and morality on public transport really suggests a kind of tacit demand on behalf of men that the public morality in cities, which shapes urban citizenship in the substantive sense, this kind of public morality ought to also support the maintenance of the sexual division of labor in the family. In other words, the adjudication of conduct on public transport ought to be premised on the compulsions of the householder ethic, which in fact situates adult men as providers and protectors of their family. Now, the salience of the householder ethic in Indian men's urban lives shows that gendered morality of family life well exceeds the doorsteps of the family, and they begin to condition everyday encounters with public transport. I had to sort of wrap up quickly in the interest of time, but I'm happy to elaborate this last part of the presentation if it comes up in the question and answer. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.